Okay, so in another departure of my normal channel, which is DIY, kind of interior design stuff, I decided to do a character analysis of the Heated Rivalry characters. So I did one on Shane, and it kind of focused mostly on like Myers-Briggs, but I'm gonna do one on Ilya today, and his has a lot more layers than just, what his personality type is. There's some trauma, there's some family dynamics, there's a lot going on, so we're just gonna do a deep dive. Quick disclaimer, I've studied like personality type stuff, but the other stuff I'm going to touch on that has to do with, trauma and things like that, this is just me being like an armchair psychologist, Psych 101. So don't, take anything I say too seriously. This is meant purely for entertainment. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to bring up is why we love Ilya. He's got like this bad boy image, but I'd say the most interesting thing about him is he's a study of contrasts. So he's very stoic, and yet he's quite tender. He's very devil-may-care, but also he's very scared in some ways. He's very biting, but also empathetic. And he's very upfront or candid, and yet secretive. Other things we love about Ilya, he's struggling with the high expectations around him, whether that's in the hockey field, living up to Russian excellence, his father, and even himself. And third, he yearns, which again is something that we brought up. This is kind of one of the main things between the two characters, Shane and Ilya. They're always yearning. Ilya in particular is yearning for a sense of belonging, and he also wants to be himself and wants Shane. So I want to go in a little bit about the family dynamics and how that has shaped Ilya. The first thing I want to talk about is his father, because I think his father has created an environment that makes it hard for him to trust himself and other people. One of the things that we learn in episode 6 is that his mother accidentally swallowed a whole bottle of pills. And if you read the book, you learn that the word accident is used here because that's what Ilya's father told him to say. Ilya has spent a long time obscuring the truth, and for somebody who actually likes to be upfront, and that makes you live with a lot of cognitive dissonance. Furthermore, he's had to hide himself a lot. He doesn't really trust that people will love him if they knew the real him because he's hiding all these aspects of his life. The other thing about his father is that he's extremely critical. He's critical of Ilya, and he was critical of his mother. So sometimes when you grow up in a household where there's a lot of marital strife, there is a projection of the parents' relationship on a future partner. So Ilya is witnessing his father being really critical of his mother that may have worsened her depression. Ilya doesn't want to recreate the same marital strife he experienced as a kid, so he avoids commitment and intimacy. Another bit of insight we get about his father is that he has dementia. There's a lot of guilt that's associated with that and taking care of his father. In the book, actually, you learn that he actually likes his father better this way because he's almost less critical because he doesn't remember a lot of stuff. The third thing to consider in general, I believe in the show they call it dementia, but in the book it's Alzheimer's, and there's a genetic component to that. So that might be something that is going through his head too, that like, hey, this is hereditary. This is also a future, an uncertain future that I have to look forward to. Moving on to his mother, there's a lot of heavy stuff here, right? So he's the one who finds her when she swallows the bottle of pills, which could lead to feelings of guilt and self-blame. But even more than that, you kind of could take away the lesson that like, this is what happens when you care too much for somebody. They abandon you, they leave you. People are not safe. And to kind of cope with that, to prevent that from happening again, you might, and perhaps Ilya, avoids commitment and intimacy. It's just a way to make sure that he can't get hurt again. Some of the ways that you can avoid getting hurt is also sort of numb yourself to those feelings, right? So you're numbing yourself to bad feelings. And when you do that, it has the converse, effect of numbing you to good things. And so then you really have to heighten the good things. So you do these pleasure-seeking activities. We see Ilya going to clubs, we see him drinking a lot, kind of this overindulgence. So a way to, again, avoid feeling these horrible feelings is to overindulge and numb out the bad. A couple times we see him kind of zoning out because that's the only way for him to deal with the criticism or bad feelings. Instead of like truly processing them and letting them go, he is distracting himself from them. So this entire experience with his mother also leads to thoughts of abandonment. So here he has his mother, someone who's supposed to love you unconditionally, and she leaves him essentially. So he might have some self-worth issues. Is he not lovable? Things like that. And thinks that if people truly knew him, they would leave. And then one of the last things I wanted to point out about his mother is she has depression, and that also has a genetic component. So again, Ilya is probably thinking, oh, here's another thing that waits me in the future, depression. So he has his father's Alzheimer's, which is something that he could develop, and depression that he could develop. So these are other things that are weightier that he might want to numb himself or distract himself away from feeling. Okay, the last person that we talk about is his brother, and I think this relationship is a little bit hard to read because we don't understand why he hates him so much and yet still needs his money. So you could think, oh, maybe there's just like some jealousy at the root of it, but I think what we actually are seeing is displaced hatred. When his mother swallowed that bottle of pills, she abandoned him. And he can't be mad at her because she was sad, depressed, whatever. She's not even there. So he displaces his hatred and puts it on Ilya. It's really easy to place his hatred on Ilya because it sounds like he's a lot like her. You know, Ilya will describe in episode 6 that she was so funny, beautiful, but so sad, and his father was really hard on her. Like, these are all descriptors of Ilya. And so perhaps when Alexei looks at his brother, he sees her, displaces his hatred of his mother abandoning him on Ilya. Ilya essentially abandons his brother to go off to play hockey. So anything that Ilya does to sort of help the situation, send money to his brother, to his father, you know, do all the arrangements for the funeral, it's never going to be enough because this is not a problem of Ilya's making. This is a problem of his brother's making. I think another reason why Ilya feels pulled to help him and to have a relationship with his brother in some form is because they have shared memories of his mother, and he's pretty much the only one who experienced what it was to grow up in that household. His father has dementia. He's losing whatever, you know, memories he has of his former wife, but also is probably not really upfront to talk about it. And so this is like this one link to his mother, and it's not even a relationship that he can explore that, like, memory-wise. So it's a pretty heavy thing that Ilya carries around, that he wants this relationship with his brother, even perhaps just to keep the memory of his mother alive. And yet his brother is so angry at what his mother did, and he blames Ilya for it. Okay, so from these experiences, he's had some learned behavior, some things that he's learned to do to cope with all of this crap, right? So one of the things is you typically learn how to react to your own feelings from your mother. And that's because they tend to be the more demonstrative of the parents. And he doesn't have that. His mother passes away when he's 12, which is a very pivotal time in a person's life. And his father's pretty much telling him, this is how you deal with your feelings, which is to not deal with them, right? He has been hard on his mother, who was sad. And so he's pretty much saying, like, sadness is not an acceptable feeling here. Sadness is a form of weakness. And in episode 6, we even see it that Ilya will say, like, I don't want you to think that she's weak. And he's kind of saying it to convince himself that he doesn't think it's weak, but he's been programmed to think it is. In general, sadness is like this very loud, expressive emotion, right? It comes with tears, you know, there's like a lot of heaving, and, you know, it kind of is a cry for help. If you're sad, it's like, it's a visual and auditory cry for help. And men are sort of taught not to cry out for help, right? They're taught to fix their own problems. So sadness is not a place that he's allowed to go to. Anger, like his father and his brother exhibit, that's a place that men are allowed to go to, because anger kind of gets this momentum in you that says, I'm going to fix my own problems. So that's a direction that he is allowed to go to. And a lot of men are told that they are allowed to go to. In general, men are kind of told to fix their feeling problems in the outer world. Yeah, I'm going to get up and I'm going to go. You know, even we see this with Ilya. You know, he's feeling all this consternation about Shane because he sees all this stuff with him and Rose. And he's just like, I can't sit here and think and process these thoughts. Let me get up, let's go to a club, let me get laid, because that will fix the problem. But it's never going to fix the problem, because you can't fix inner feelings in the outer world. It's about sitting and processing and, you know, being uncomfortable with them for a while. So we have these avoidant behaviors, we have these abandonment issues. He has just this whole cyclone of psychological stuff that he's dealing with on top of how he's naturally wired. Taking in all that information, I think it's important to understand what is really at stake when considering a relationship with Shane. I know they talk about this like, oh, they're being a toxic relationship, but number one, this is probably both of theirs first real relationships. They're like 18 when they start this, so this is them learning, you know, like maturing throughout this process. So of course they're gonna, you know, be immature. But I think people underestimate what is really at stake for Ilya in particular, for him to actually pursue a relationship with Shane. So what would it mean for Ilya to pursue a relationship with Shane? It would mean giving up his family, right? These people that he feels this responsibility for and this tenuous link to his mother with, which is a really heavy thing to do. It would almost be like repeating his mother's initial betrayal of abandoning them, which is something that he has so much trouble even being angry about, right? He would essentially become an orphan, no parents, no brother. And furthermore, he would be leaving Russia. And yes, probably not a friendly place for him, probably a place where he hides himself a lot. But there's more at stake than just that. It's like your home. And even beyond a language barrier, I don't know if any of you have learned a second language, it's really hard to be yourself in another language. Your humor changes, how you express yourself changes, there's a cultural dynamic to it. So to not be that version of yourself where you were, that you've been for the majority of your life anymore, that's a pretty big deal. He'd also be giving up kind of a part of himself, right? He's not going to always be at home in his adopted country, even if he wasn't always at home in his homeland. So he's giving up a version of himself by not being able to go back to Russia. And then there's the whole punitive side of it, like, if he tried to go back, what would that mean for him? Like he doesn't even want to explore that. I don't think we've talked about hockey, but hockey for him has always been like an escape. So to lose that escape, the thing that was a distraction from everything bad, he doesn't have a replacement for that in his life. This was something that he gave a lot of focus to, a sense of purpose. His relationship with Shane to get out and perhaps make it so he couldn't be a hockey player anymore would be extremely difficult. And as I explained before, he's got these abandonment issues, and he's been hiding a lot from Shane about himself. And there's probably something still at the root of this, of his low self-worth, that if Shane really does get to know him, the real him, even given all this, he might leave him. So there's that fear as well. And now would be a great time to pause the video, go into the comments and write down what you think his Myers-Briggs type is, and then we can debate it out. So that was all of his backstory, and now I'm just going to kind of dive into his Myers-Briggs type, or his wiring. My hypothesis is that he is an ESTP. Overall, ESTPs are risk takers. They love to live in the moment. They care more about the experience than the outcome. They're very empathetic. They are kind of directionless in general, but they like to test the limits. So they're very persuasive. They're good at making deals. They are adrenaline seeking, and they tend to not be in tune with their personal values. So just a quick overview. E stands for extrovert. So his version of extroversion is not about being social per se. It's kind of about being in the outer world. So if you're introvert, you're more in your head, in the inner world, and that's the real world for you. But as an extrovert, you're in the outer world. So he is very physical, both on the ice and other places, but he's kind of exacting change in the physical world, and he gets feedback from the physical world. The next letter is S for sensor. Sensors tend to be very grounded. They like concrete data. They're very realistic. They're not looking to make these sort of large abstract leaps. The next letter is T for thinker. His version of thinking is all about asking what is reasonable, rational, logical. They care about precision and accuracy. And then the last letter is P for perceiver, and that has a little bit more to do with where you like organization. So do you like organization in the real world, like Shane does? He likes to have things just so. Or do you like organization in your inner world, where you can retrieve information very quickly so that you can improvise in the outer world? So I think it's pretty obvious that Ilya likes to improvise, kind of work on the fly, so he is a perceiver. So while I'm going through this analysis, I would love for you to let me know in the comments below if you agree with this type. Do you think he's something else? Do you got some evidence for it? I think this would be a great discussion for all of us in the comment section. So now we're going to go into the cognitive functions. These are the mental processes that Ilya uses to make decisions and take in information. So his first function is his dominant function. It's the tool that he uses for every job. This is the one he feels most comfortable with. And this is about how he takes information. It's called extroverted sensing, or SE. And it's about taking in information in the real world, in real time, kind of using your 5 senses. So your sense of touch, feel, hearing, taste, Those are how he takes in information. Like, can he see this? Can he touch this? And it makes a person really good at reading physical cues, understanding what's going on based on what they are reading in a physical environment. So makes him a very good hockey player. So SE also is about one perspective, that person's perspective, in real time. So it makes him very observant, very opportunistic, very grounded in reality. And essentially, they're always trying to push the limits to sort of find out where they are. Like, you kind of have to push past the limit to know, like, here's where the line is. So Ilya is constantly doing that in different parts of his life. So SE Doms want to be in a very visceral, immersive experience. They want to engage with the physical world and challenge themselves physically. Let's look at some examples of Ilya using extroverted sensing, or SE. So the first thing I want to point out is that he's very observant, right? Makes him a great hockey player. He sees things on the ice in real time and takes advantage of those things. He's also really observant about Shane, like he knows what he likes, what he doesn't like. He enters his house, he automatically takes his shoes off. In episode 6, we see that he feels confident splashing Shane with water because he knows that Shane's phone is in the house and it's been ringing all morning. Now, he's not making any sort of intuitive leaps as to why it's ringing, but he knows where items are in place. So one of the themes of extroverted sensing is kind of the physical world. And we see that Ilya is a very physical person, whether that's, indulging in things like sex or being in a club. That's this very immersive experience, a lot of music, a lot of movement, a lot of people. But also we see that he is physical when he's trying to get himself out of his head. Like, you see him like literally shake himself out of a bad call in episode 4 when he's thinking about that with his, father. In episode 5, there's almost like this visible shaking to get himself out of his feelings. He uses physical touch for comfort, and he likes physical touch as comfort for himself. And when you experience things physically, sometimes they're not something that you can describe, like there might not be words for it. And he even teasingly talks to Shane about, like, do you want to know how it feels to hold the cup? Well, I couldn't even explain it, it's just this feeling. So his feelings are very much felt physically. I guess another thing too, you'll notice that he has like this oral fixation, but that could just be Jacob Tierney always wanting to put something in the mouth of all of his characters. So another theme of extroverted sensing is impulsivity. We see that a lot with Ilya. He's going to make a move to kind of get out of his thoughts. So when he's frustrated with the situation between Rose and Shane, he's like, let me get out of my head. Let me get out of this hotel room. Let's go to a club. Let me get laid. That's going to fix everything. So it's like these kind of impulsive moves. And he impulsively says things a lot to kind of get momentum going. So he's also very opportunistic. It's probably why he's such a good hockey player, because he is taking advantage of opportunities in real time. It's not like Shane's very studied version of hockey playing where he understands the potential moves, where he ought to be. This is something that he has learned over time. For Ilya, it's like, ooh, I go there. If I do that, then I can do this. And it's just like getting into direct action. So another theme of extroverted sensing is overindulgence. So I think you notice when Shane gets into his feelings, he kind of hibernates. He's like, let me be by myself. Let me kind of like lick my wounds. For Ilya, he's like, no, let me get into my body. That's how I can get out of my feelings, if you will. So he will overindulge. He smokes, he drinks, and he uses sex as a way to kind of avoid being in his thoughts. Introverted thinking is his second function, also called the auxiliary function, and we call it TI for short. So introverted thinking is a process by which you make decisions, and it's pointed inwardly. So while ESTPs tend to have a natural talent for this, it's a little bit of a push because as an extrovert, they don't want to really go internally, but when they do, they're their best selves, essentially. TI is asking a question like, what makes sense? Like, what is rational, logical in this situation? And it kind of needs to be divorced from societal expectations or norms for it to work well, because those kinds of things can cloud the actual truth. It's looking for precision, accuracy. It's breaking down a system and finding leverage points and incongruities. Therefore, autonomy of thought is extremely important in this case. So where are we seeing this with Ilya? The first theme I kind of wanted to explore of introverted thinking is calibration, or accuracy. You notice this with Ilya a lot. He kind of calibrates what he says He'll say one thing and then he'll refine that statement a couple of times. In episode 5, Shane asks Ilya, how he's doing over the phone when his father passes away. And he says, okay, not good, probably bad. So it takes this sort of refining thing until he hits on the actual truth of the matter. He does this a lot of times, but he also does it in episode 6 when they're talking to his parents about when their relationship started. He corrects Shane. He says no, it was summer before, because precision is important here. Another time he says that is when, Shane's like, oh, your boyfriend? And he says, yes, I think so, probably. Calibrating what he's saying until he hits on the right answer. Another place where you see this need for precision in Ilya is kind of his frustration with his English skills. He makes a big deal about the fact that Shane is fluent in French, and here he's still struggling to express truly what he wants to say. And in the book, he kind of backs this up. He feels like he's an oaf when he's talking in English. Even when he's kind of having this clumsy discussion with Shane to figure out what Shane's, sexual identity is, he's kind of examining the boundaries of the system. He's trying to really understand precisely, is Shane bisexual as well? Is he gay? Is he, pan, whatever? That's what he's trying to get to, is with this discussion. So seeking the boundaries, being more exact. You also see him seeking the boundaries of things to get more precision about the limits. He's constantly needling Shane to see is this too far? Is this too much? Okay, pull back here. And again, to figure out what the boundaries of what is too far is, you kind of have to exceed the boundaries. So he's constantly testing other people to see where the boundaries are. Other places to find the boundaries is using consent, kind of continuing to ask, is this okay? Is this okay? So that is another feature of him trying to understand the boundaries, be very precise about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So another theme of introverted thinking is about truth. So TI users typically care about finding the fundamental truth. And he does prefer to be a straightforward person. It's just that his life is not set up in a way that he gets to be. So there's a lot of cognitive dissonance there. Typically, if you are a TI user and you're living in a world with a lot of cognitive dissonance, it's very difficult. So he probably avoids being in this function too much because it makes him realize that he is hiding his true self. In other places, he loves to be candid. He likes to even tell other people. He uses kind of this function on other people in a sort of parental way. Like when he talks to Shane and says, I think that you can tell them you're gay without giving them a list of all the guys that you're sleeping with. That is him sort of telling him that, truth is important. In fact, when he finally admits to himself and to Shane, I guess in Russian, though Shane can't hear it, that he loves Shane, it's kind of a truth that he can't unsee anymore. And so it becomes this pivotal point at which he has to decide, do I leave or do I stay? Before that, he was able to sort of be like, we don't know the limits of this relationship. We don't know what this is. Is this just a situationship? And so he could sort of drag it out. But now that he kind of can't unsee this truth anymore, a decision must be made. Another theme of introverted thinking is competitiveness. So for Ilya, being competitive, it's about pushing his own limits. It's about mastery. He doesn't really even care if people like him. In fact, he prefers to be in New York where they hate him. He doesn't need this adulation from people. It's really about pushing himself and looking at the physical limits of the game and how he can do that. Whereas Shane likes the adulation. He needs other people to tell him he's good to some extent. He pushes himself because of the expectations he has on himself and the expectations that his family has on him. But for Ilya, it's pretty much the one place that he feels a sense of control. So that's why it's such a good escape for him. So another theme of introverted thinking is logic. What is rational, what makes sense. So when he sort of chastises, Shane for making 8 burgers, you just do math. You cut the recipe in half, no big deal. He tries to explain to Shane the idea of sort of reciprocal trouble. Of course I'm not going to say anything. I have as much to lose as you do. He even gave the example of his coach's son as well and why that didn't work. But he needed it spelled out. So he eventually spelled out why he wasn't going to tell anybody about their relationship. Also, you'll see logic in his deal making. It's a very rational, if this, then this. And so everything is laid out on the table. The last thing I want to talk about in introverted thinking is autonomy, or sort of being divorced from societal expectations. He cares about autonomy, about being his true self, or about being kind of upfront. But he kind of lives in a society and a sport that hinders his ability to be fully candid. So he also uses it, again, as his parental function. He gives autonomy to others. It's sort of like a you do you kind of thing. So I think it's worth mentioning that he lives in Russia, a place that condemns being queer. And for a lot of people, that could make them have some sort of self-hatred about themselves. But it doesn't do that to Ilya. In fact, in the book, he kind of mentions that when he started sleeping with men, it made him feel more evolved. So the societal expectations from his culture don't really affect him. He is divorced from some of these societal norms. His father is constantly critical, and he kind of gives him this responsibility of, not letting Russia down. I don't think that particularly bothers him. I think his relationship with his father bothers him, and he can never live up to his father's expectations. I don't think he feels any particular loyalty to Russia per se as this sort of group or culture. And I would even say the same thing for, his team in Boston. He doesn't feel a sense of loyalty to Boston as an organization like Shane feels this need to live up to the expectations of the Montreal Metros because there's this expectation of the fans. Okay, so his third function, or tertiary function, is called extroverted feeling, or FE. FE is the polar opposite of the ESTP's auxiliary function of TI. So where TI is divorced from societal expectations, FE cares only about consensus and meeting the needs of the group. It's a decision-making function that is pointed outwardly and asks, what needs need to be met? So FE is attuned to feelings and the needs of others and can often absorb the feelings of people around them kind of out of nowhere. And FE as well often forgets to attune to its own needs. FE sees feelings as actionable, and it's kind of like, let's fix feelings in the outer world. The tertiary function comes out negatively in times of stress and positively in times of play and intimacy. As this is a tertiary function, ESTPs do not have the same level of certainty with it as they do with their top two functions, and ESTPs don't always trust this function, so they might treat it with less nuance at times. So several examples of FE in Ilya. The first theme I want to explore is rapport building. So Ilya is very good at this. We see him playing with the kids at the pool. He's developing a rapport with them. They're having fun. And rapport is just about developing a sort of an emotional vibe with a group, right? Or an individual. And I think another way that you can develop rapport is to cause a fight. That's why some couples will get into a fight, because it almost forces them to talk to each other, to develop a rapport, to become more intimate. So he's constantly needling Shane. It pushes Shane out of his comfort zone, but it develops rapport, sometimes to good effect and sometimes to not so great effect. The other theme I want to talk about is meeting people's needs. So because this is his third function, it's something he feels uncertain with, and it's a place where his family is able to sort of take advantage of him. You see his brother extorting him for money, his father criticizing him, and he just sort of takes it. So because he is very sensitive to this obligation to his family and he's uncertain in this function, people take advantage of him here. But he also is really good at taking care of the needs of other people, like Shane. He's got the tuna melt set up, he's got the, Canada Dry, and he attunes to the needs of Shane quite a bit, actually. He also pushes himself to excel for other people. So we see when he's celebrating winning the cup that he says, this is for you, mama. And, that's another place where he is trying to meet other people's needs. This is a place also where he absorbs other people's feelings. So when he's walking in the tunnel in Russia and he's explaining what went down with his brother, he says, his brother was scared. Like he read that situation correctly, and it made his brother terrible, and then it made him terrible. Like he absorbed those feelings from his brother and reacted in kind. Overall, he's also a very good host. He, besides the tuna melts and the ginger ale, he's making sure everything is arranged for his father's funeral, that they have the best food, that he's, properly buried. All these things are set up, and it's because he cares about making sure people have what they need. So the next thing I want to talk about is belonging, his need to belong, and yet he kind of stands as this lone wolf bird, if you will. So for example, he is the captain of his team, but he's not of them, he's just, he seems slightly apart. And also when it comes to his family, he doesn't feel like a part of it. For them, they see a bank or an enemy, but he doesn't get to be part of the family. Another place he doesn't belong, English is his second language. He feels separate from that. He's essentially a stranger in both countries that he lives in, right? Because he can't be his true self. It kind of makes sense that he'd be okay with being a hockey player because you're constantly moving, and that is a way for him to distract himself from, registering feelings and things like that. The last thing I want to talk about is charm. So he's a very charming, persuasive guy, right? He's actually the captain of the team, and I believe that this role allows him to talk to refs and sort of persuade one way or the other. So you might want a captain who is very, even-keeled and steady, like Shane, or perhaps somebody who's very charming, like, Ilya is, to persuade. There's also a lot of charm in how he persuades Shane to do what Shane actually really wants to do. Part of having charm is understanding how you're being perceived, and so he does care about how he's being perceived. When he calls Shane after his father has passed away, he asks immediately, what are they saying about me? Because he wants to project a certain persona. By controlling his image, he can control the situation and the vibes and be persuasive. Moving on, we're going to quickly go over his last function, which is called introverted intuition, and we're going to call it NI for short. Introverted intuition is the polar opposite of his first function of extroverted sensing. So extroverted sensing is like, what is my one perspective in this moment? Introverted intuition steps into multiple perspectives and runs simulations on what may occur. It is a function that takes in information by patterning and speculating on probable outcomes. So introverted intuition categorizes thematically, organizing individual data points as symbols of particular archetypes. Now, as this is an inferior function, it's kind of like a blind spot for ESTPs. ESTPs feel a deep uncertainty with this function, and NI manifests sometimes with less nuance as more of a paranoia about what other people think about them. So where you notice that extroverted sensing flies in the face of danger, introverted intuition as an inferior function sees new dangers and fears. Once ESTPs mature, this function can be a source of aspiration, pushing an individual to contemplate a path forward in a meditative way that builds excitement for the future rather than fear. So some examples of introverted intuition in Ilya include kind of like this uncertainty around the future. It's really hard to see a probable path forward. He doesn't have an example of it, right? But also all of the stakes that I described in the beginning, what would that look like to give up family, Russia, hockey as an escape? It just feels like a very stuck place for him. So he can't see a probable outcome. And so he feels very uncomfortable with the uncertainty of just jumping into this like he jumps into a lot of other things. It also makes him suspicious or conspiratorial about other people's feelings about him. So we see in episode 6 that he gets uncomfortable when he notices that Shane just got a text from Rose. And it's part of that self-worth thing where he thinks that like, oh, he could drop me for somebody that's a lot easier, and just go to Rose. He really distrusts plans and feels like they're going to fall apart. Kind of sees the bigger picture, this kind of meta perspective, as being very convoluted. And so why even contemplate, a future? Until Scott Hunter comes out and it becomes this pivotal thing, because now the variables have realigned and he can see a future. Now he knows what it looks like when somebody comes out, and now this is a step closer to understanding a probable future. Another theme of introverted intuition as a fourth function in Ilya is kind of in paranoia. He kind of wonders if fate is out to get him. He wonders what other people are thinking about him. And the last theme of introverted intuition is symbolism. So because introverted intuition is pattern recognizing and it kind of categorizes things thematically, then they kind of take on this sort of symbolic energy, if you will. And he has a lot of symbols in his life. He wears his mother's cross, which symbolizes his love for her or that she's with him in some way. And then also he's the one who comes up with, different names for them, like Shane is Jane. And I think it's kind of funny that Jane, obviously it's pretty direct, like it's not like a huge leap to have these names that sound similar, but plain Jane, he kind of calls Shane boring a lot. And so I think there's some symbolism there. And also plainness being something that he actually wants, His name is, Lily, and I don't think he's this deep, but you could look at it as like lilies are these very sensitive, kind of temperamental flowers, actually. And at the root of him, he is a very sensitive person. Okay, that's the end of this video. If you want me to do a third video where I talk about how these two types interact with each other, what kind of problems it brings up, how complementary they are, things like that, please let me know, and bye.